you're all quieting down, it's time to begin. My name is Jim Turk. I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. And on behalf of the Center, I want to welcome all of you to our event this evening. This is one of a series. We do about a dozen public events each year at the Center. Our next one is going to be on Tuesday night on police surveillance and civil liberties. And then in November, we're having one on cultural appropriation. So we like to deal with a lot of difficult and edgy topics and feel the best way to deal with those is by discussion, debate, criticism, evaluation, and so forth. We also have a film series looking at really interesting films that deal with issues of repression, dissent, and freedom of expression. And they're on the second Tuesday of every month. We do them jointly with the Documentary Media Research Center and the School of Image Arts here, and they're in the theater school in the School of Image Arts. So if any of you are interested in being on our email list just to hear of these events and so on, Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, is passing around 2 clipboards, and just put your name and email address on, and you'll get one more email added to the many that you already receive. Also, if you want to know more about what we do or have a podcast of Nadine's talk tonight, it'll be on our website as of tomorrow, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. I'd like to introduce the executive director of the organization that's co-sponsoring tonight's event, the Institute for Liberal Studies. And the executive director, Matt Buffton, is with us, and I'd like to invite him to come forward and say a few things.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just going to speak very briefly about the Institute for Liberal Studies because I know it's an organization that's new to many of you, although I see a few current students and former students in the audience who have attended a number of our events. We are an educational nonprofit based in Ottawa. We are no connection with the Liberal Party of Ontario or Canada or anything, but we are deeply interested in exploring the classical liberal tradition and all that carries with it in terms of respect for political liberties, respect for economic liberties, and all sorts of freedom. A lot of the events that we do, we like to partner with campus partners. We're active pretty much across Canada. We do about 35 to 40 campus events per year. Very happy to be and grateful to be able to work with the CFA to bring Nadine Strossen here. If you'd like to learn more about the stuff that we do, especially if you're a student or know a student who might be interested, you can check out our website at liberalstudies.ca. And to give you an extra incentive to go to our website, we have a couple copies of Nadine's book, which I'm going to ask her to sign after the talk. And if you would like to win potentially one of these books, you can go to our website, liberalstudies.ca/Strossen. Just her last name. It's on the posters all around, so you can find it. liberalstudies.ca/Strossen. There's a very short form you can fill in. We'll be taking entries until midnight tonight. And when I get back to the office tomorrow, we're going to randomly select a couple of those names and mail out a couple copies of this book to a couple of you. With that, I'm going to pass back to Jim to introduce our speaker.
I'm embarrassed. I'm at what prides itself as the most entrepreneurial university in Canada. And clearly I'm not as entrepreneurial as Matt and the Institute for Liberal Studies. Never thought of having a draw for books as a way of drawing people to our site. So I've learned a lesson for you, Matt. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce the reason that all of us are here tonight, and that's talk by Nadine Strossen. Her day job is as John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. She has written, taught, and advocated extensively in areas of constitutional law and civil liberties for many years, as most of you know. From 1991 until 2008, she served as president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first woman to head the United States' largest and oldest and most powerful civil liberties organization. Professor Strossen is currently a member of the ACLU's Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of the Electronic Privacy Information Center and FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. When she stepped down from the ACLU presidency in 2008, to give you some sense of the regard in which she is held, 3 Supreme Court justices turned up for her reception, her retirement event, and across a wide political spectrum, from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Antonin Scalia to David Souter. Not many of us have Supreme Court justices turning up at our events when we retire or step aside from. Maybe Jamie Cameron will. I'm not sure. Professor Strossen is also a prolific writer and an indefatigable speaker. In the past, well, just let me tell you, since Sunday. So, actually, I don't know where you were. Yeah, she was in Nashville. She's speaking in Nashville on Sunday, in Raleigh or Durham, North Carolina on Monday, in Portland, Maine. No, in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, in Portland, Maine yesterday, and got up at 4 this morning to catch a 6 o'clock flight from Portland, Maine to Newark to be here with us today and tomorrow. She's taking Saturday off, slacker that she is, and then resuming her itinerary going to Pittsburgh on Sunday. Her writings have been published in many scholarly and general interest publications. She has more than 300 published works. And among her notable books are Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. Her co-authored book, Speaking of Race, Speaking of Sex, Hate Speech, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. And Oxford University Press has just published, actually in May, her most recent book, which Matt is offering you a free chance to get a copy of if you don't have it, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. In 2017, the American Bar Association presented Professor Strossen with the Margaret Brent Women's Lawyer of Achievement Award, which, quote, celebrates the achievements of women lawyers who have excelled in their field and have paved the way to success for other women lawyers. By the way, I'm only getting allowed to give this long introduction. She was going to stop me, but I reminded her she was committed to free speech, so she couldn't do that. She also has won numerous other awards. The National Law Journal named her as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. Vanity Fair included her in America's 200 most influential women. Ladies' Home Journal named her among America's 100 most important women. Working Women magazine listed her among the 350 women who changed the world. Her work has been recognized by a number of universities. At the count I did, you had 6 honorary degrees from different institutions. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard College and magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. And before becoming a professor of constitutional law, she practiced law both in her hometown of Minneapolis and in New York. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the meeting over to her and look forward to hearing her, as I'm sure all of you are.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Jim for that really generous introduction, and thank you to Jim and Matt and Ange for enormous, very, very excellent and appreciated work in organizing this. And thank all of you for sharing your precious time with me. And I am going to single out one member of the audience because he is actually sharing his birthday with us, and that is my dear friend Lynn Waverman, who is the dean of the business school at McMaster. So thank you. I hope that this is worth your time on your birthday. It's also fun to see in person many old friends, some of whom I've met in person, but many of whom I've only had the pleasure of corresponding with over email, including colleagues in the Canadian Council for Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which is obviously a very close colleague with the ACLU. So I want to talk about the ideas in my book. And I'll get into it by, actually, I suppose I could look at the screen there, but I'll show you the cover of the book itself, because the book jacket designer really showed the truth in that old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, or in this case, a lot more than 1,000 words. Without having consulted with me, I thought he brilliantly captured the essence of what I was addressing in the book. So the big word there in block letters was and is my preeminent concern: hate. It is too much of an ongoing problem, not only in my country, but also in your country and all over the world, with an upsurge in hateful expression and attitudes and conduct and violence. I am very concerned about resisting it. And the only verb in the title of my book is resist. It is preeminently a book about resisting and reducing and doing everything we can to prevent hatred, discrimination, stereotyping. Yes, it is also an anti-censorship book, but that is because I am absolutely convinced now more than ever, after having done the research for the book, that the only effective way to resist hatred is through free speech and other non-censorial strategies. So that's what's captured by the subtitle, and why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. When my dear husband saw the book cover, he said, you know, I think there's a problem there, which is that it's too hard to read the main title. The subtitle is obscuring it. And I said, yes, that is exactly the point that I want to convey, that we can resist and counter and overcome hate, and we do it with free speech. And I will tell a story on myself, even though I've been teaching constitutional law for many decades now. It took somebody else to point out to me the font in which the subtitle is written is the same font in which the US Constitution is written. Now I've been addressing this issue for many, many years, even before I became ACLU president. When I graduated from law school, shortly thereafter, the ACLU handled a case that is our most famous, and many people would say our most infamous case, which is very much at the center of the issues we're talking about tonight and that are discussed in the book. And it is a case that epitomizes not only the ACLU position on freedom of speech and hatred, but also the American legal position. And if I say one word, I know many people in the audience will know exactly what the case is about: Skokie. In 1977, the ACLU, an organization that for almost 100 years now has been on the forefront of fighting for fundamental freedoms for all people, fighting for equality and against discrimination, working hand in glove with the NAACP to counter discrimination, being on the forefront of every movement for equality, including for women and sexual and gender minorities and everyone. The ACLU, nonetheless, came to the defense of the free speech rights of a group of neo-Nazis. And as if that's not bad enough, these neo-Nazis were protesting in Skokie, Illinois, near Chicago, a town that had a very large Jewish population. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Skokie, Illinois in 1977 had a very large population of Holocaust survivors. 1 out of every 6 people who lived in Skokie then was either a Holocaust survivor or very closely related, a spouse, a son, a daughter, etc. And so it was very confounding to the public at large that the ACLU would come to the defense of the free speech rights of an organization that was completely advocating the antithesis of the civil liberties principles that we were devoted to. But you see, we were true to that precept that has been attributed to Voltaire. I may disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. And that actually is a core principle of U.S. First Amendment free speech jurisprudence. In fact, it's a very, very complicated body of law, and yet the Supreme Court has said repeatedly that all of that body of law has one bedrock principle. And that bedrock principle is the one that was upheld in the Skokie case. We lawyers call it content neutrality or viewpoint neutrality. That government must remain neutral with respect to the content of speech, its viewpoint, its message, its idea. No matter how hateful or hated that content is, by no matter how broad a section of the public or of government officials, that is never a justification for censoring it. The appropriate response to speech whose content we loathe and fear and despise is not suppression, but rather counter speech. So the Skokie case was a slam dunk winner in the courts of law, but it was a very unpopular case in the court of public opinion. I'm going to tell you two facts that kind of illustrate that. One is about my dear father, and I'll say more about him later, but I would say in the late 1980s, my father had retired to San Diego, California, and there were a series of racist and anti-Semitic hate speech incidents in San Diego. So I was brought out there by some synagogues and mosques, and it was an interfaith coalition that brought me out there to explain the ACLU's position in these fundamental First Amendment principles. And my dear father, who had not heard me give a speech since my high school commencement address, which he also disagreed with, by the way, came and, he listened very attentively, and he said, thank you for very clearly explaining the ACLU position. You have convinced me that the ACLU is correctly implementing the First Amendment. Thank you for making it clear to me that the problem is the First Amendment. And the other factual evidence I will cite here about how deeply unpopular that position was and continues to be has to do with a question actually that a couple of you asked me during the reception, and that I am constantly asked in every audience and regularly by journalists. And it's often not a question, it's often an assertion. Isn't it true that today's college students are unprecedentedly hostile toward free speech? Isn't it true that public opinion surveys show that today's students want to censor hate speech in an unprecedented way? And I have to say, yes, it's true that public opinion surveys in your country and mine, among others, show that hate speech, speech that conveys discriminatory or hateful ideas on the basis of race, religion, gender, et cetera, other demographic characteristics, that it's deeply unpopular, that people believe that it should be censored, but that is not unique to either this time or the young generation today. And Exhibit A is what happened during the Skokie case. Now, to be a card-carrying member of the ACLU, you are really a die-hard free speech absolutist. And yet, in 1977, when the ACLU came to the defense of this bedrock free speech principle that was so easy. We won in every single court, including the United States Supreme Court. We lost 15%, 15% of our card-carrying ACLU members. So it is a perennial challenge to explain this counterintuitive assertion that those of us who hate hatred, who have on the forefront of our personal values promoting individual equality and dignity and diversity and inclusivity and societal harmony and mental well-being, all of those goals that proponents of censoring hate speech assert, and I wholeheartedly share those goals. How is it that I and the ACLU can therefore nonetheless oppose censoring hate speech? And I have always believed in the past, but I revisited it recently, that counterintuitive as it might seem, well-intended as censorship is, it is ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. I revisited that. I'd made these arguments in law review articles and other publications for many years, and then I kind of put the issue aside, and I felt driven to revisit it a couple of years ago when in the United States we saw a resurgence of campus activism in support of racial justice, against abuses in the criminal justice system, against sexual violence, for rights of immigrants, for rights of LGBT people. And I know that you've had similar movements in Canada, and it's been true around the world. And I have to say, for me, this is so thrilling. I was a student activist in the late 1960s and early 1970s in favor of the same causes. And I was a little bit despondent in intervening decades because being on a campus lecture circuit and a professor and reading all the surveys, I was painfully aware that in the United States, at least, students for many decades were rather apathetic. And surveys of students that are done in great detail. In the United States, we have an institute now based at UCLA that since 1967 has been taking an extremely thorough survey of the attitudes of every single incoming college student. And for many decades, these students were completely uninterested even in following the news, let alone becoming more actively engaged. And that changed dramatically starting around 2014 to 2015, sadly and tragically, in response to very well-publicized abuses, police unjustified killing of unarmed African-American men. And I know that that's an issue that has existed forever. The ACLU had been campaigning on it forever, and the silver lining to the cloud of ongoing abuses is that, you know, with the new technology, I believe, that made videos of these incidents go viral, the issue got traction, and that spurred student activism that has really been wonderful. And the surveys now, in the last couple of years, this survey of every incoming college student in the United States has shown unprecedented numbers of students who come to campus determined to not only vote, not only follow the news, but to make the news, to vote, to be engaged as campus activists, to be engaged in their communities, and to continue to be engaged in politics and activism after they graduate from college, that the numbers now are even higher than in 1967. So that, to me, is absolutely thrilling. And especially thrilling is that minority students in particular, African American and Latino and other racial minorities, are especially feeling engaged and empowered. And that's wonderful because with the upsurge of incidents, or at least reported incidents of hatred and discrimination and violence, including police abuse and problems in the criminal justice system, certainly one potential impact of that kind of expression and conduct could be a chilling impact, right, on people of minority groups. I fully understand that one of the at least potential harms of hateful speech is that it will deter people, especially those who are in groups that are disparaged, will deter them from exercising their free speech rights. So I recognize that there are serious free speech concerns on both sides here. So again, I'm so delighted that the attention to the existing problems of hatred and discrimination has apparently, in my country at least, had a galvanizing impact, that students, including minority students, are raising their voices and exercising their First Amendment rights in unprecedented ways. That's all really, really good. But then we started to see well-publicized incidents, again, backed up by surveys, that there is hostility toward free speech, especially toward the robust concept of free speech that extends even to the thought that we hate, including hateful speech. And I was despondent in the sense that I was absolutely convinced that this robust concept of free speech is especially important for movements for social justice. And I took it upon myself, and among others who had tried to make that case in the past, clearly we had not done it persuasively enough. So that was my challenge to myself, and the challenge that I take whenever I have the joy of speaking with people such as this kind audience tonight. And I looked at the evidence in about 2 decades since I had seriously looked at the evidence of the experience of other countries, including Canada and basically every mature democracy around the world other than the United States does have anti-hate speech laws. So I was able to look at the record of, have those laws been effective in reducing hateful attitudes, expressions, conduct, and violence, and conversely, how effective have the non-censorial measures that the United States has followed been? Now, I am the first person to acknowledge serious ongoing problems in my country. I'm crusading full-time, as is the ACLU, and that's why my main message is resisting hate. But I also am very aware of the ongoing problems in other countries, including countries that have very strict anti-hate speech laws that are very vigorously enforced. Canada, the law is strict, but it is not very vigorous, or they are not very vigorously enforced, so I will use other examples. So the bottom line is that individual liberty and equality, rather than being at odds, as is so often assumed, I am more convinced than ever, are mutually reinforcing. And that is a conclusion that is supported by major civil rights and human rights organizations in the United States. The 2 organizations that I cite that do phenomenal work in countering hatred in various ways, not including advocating censorship, are the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they consistently oppose censorship. Throughout American history, every movement for social justice and racial justice has opposed censoring hate speech. The abolition movement, that was certainly true. The movement for women's rights, LGBT rights, the whole civil rights movement. And part of the reason is that their voices and their causes were always subject to censorship, including under the hate speech laws that have existed in my country and were upheld by the Supreme Court until the middle of the 20th century. So I can look at the record in the United States on a historical basis and how ineffective censoring hate speech was. And part of the reason that those who were crusading for racial and other forms of social justice opposed censorship was that their voices were disproportionately silenced. We see that pattern around the world today. That's why Martin Luther King wrote his historic letter from a Birmingham jail. And in my book, I cite many, many leaders of minority groups for many of the points that I'll be making, because I'm sensitive that those are the people who are subject to the burdens disproportionately. That said, I do want to give you a little bit of a personal insight, because I do have a personal stake in this as well. It's not just a matter of my human rights commitment as an activist. My father was born in 1922 in Berlin under the horrific Nuremberg laws, a very, very detailed chart of who belongs to which racial classification. My father was classified as a Jew of the second degree because his mother was of Jewish ancestry and his father was quote unquote Aryan. And I deliberately say of Jewish ancestry. She was part of the Meyer-Mendelssohn family. And at least her branch of the family had converted many or several generations earlier. So my father was actually raised as a Lutheran. I'm delighted to have learned that he was confirmed by the famous Pastor Niemöller, one of the heroic resistors to Nazism. And I'm very proud that my dear father, as a teenager, as a young teenager, was active politically against Hitler, so and Nazis. So for that reason, as well as his ancestry, he was sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp. He was young enough and healthy enough when he went into the camp that he was not immediately targeted for murder, but he was assigned to do forced labor, back-breaking, brutal labor in horrendous conditions with disease rampant and starvation and malnutrition. And again, you know, I just find it bizarre to say here in the 21st century that you're seeing somebody who is the daughter of somebody who was enslaved and almost died, and more than that, my life was almost extinguished before it even became a possibility, because as such an undesirable, my father was slated to be sterilized. And one day before he was scheduled to be sterilized, Buchenwald was liberated by the US military. So I have to give a shout out to the military. And by the way, because I mentioned police abuse, I feel I always have to say, of course, those are the minority. I know the vast majority of women and men who take the oath to uphold the Constitution, as the US Constitution, as military personnel do, and those who are putting their lives on the line to defend our safety and our freedom. I think we're working for the same goals, and I know that there's abuse in every profession, dare I even say the legal profession. I will associate myself with a statement that was made by Aryeh Neyer, who was the executive director of the ACLU at the time that we took the Skokie case. Aryeh himself was a Holocaust survivor, a bit younger than my father. His whole extended family was completely obliterated by the Nazis. He and his immediate family managed to escape to the United States. And he is at the forefront of the ACLU defending freedom of speech for Nazis in Skokie. He got, a tremendous amount of hate mail and threats, including for many in the Jewish community. After that experience, he wrote a book, which is a classic. I highly recommend it, called Defending My Enemy. And he said something in that book that I completely associate with, given my own experience. And many people are surprised to hear this because they understand that Aryeh is one of the most prominent defenders of free speech in the world. After being the executive director of the ACLU, he went on to become the founding executive director of Human Rights Watch, the founding director of George Soros's Open Society Foundation, truly one of the most prominent human rights champions in the world. And in this book, he said, and I completely agree, he said, I love free speech. I love free speech. But much as I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis even more than I love free speech. So if I thought that censoring their speech would have prevented their rise to power, would have prevented the Holocaust, would have prevented genocide, I would have been all in favor of the censorship. And I agree with that. And so you understand that the conclusion that we should resist, but we should do it without censorship, is based at least as much, or can be complete, we lawyers would say, there's an independently sufficient basis for that conclusion, even apart from free speech principles, which is pragmatic and policy and strategic concerns about how to advance all of the goals that are hoped to be advanced through censorship. So many people are surprised that in the Weimar Republic, during which the Nazis rose to power, there were strict anti-hate speech laws. One of the people who made this point quite early was a Canadian friend of mine, and I know of many of yours in the audience, Alan Borovoy, who was the longtime executive director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And Alan wrote about this, as have many historians as well, that not only, and in fact, Alan has been quoted in some, unfortunately, dissenting opinions by the Canadian Supreme Court. The dissenters were arguing that even under your Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I know doesn't have quite as strong free speech guarantee as the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, but enough to persuade, 4 justices on your court that the hate speech laws should be overturned. And those 4 justices quoted Alan Borovoy to this point, among others, that not only did the Weimar Republic have strict anti-hate speech laws, but they were strictly enforced, and in particular, the leading Jewish organizations at the time said that these laws are being effectively enforced. It's not as if there are botched prosecutions. And guess what? The Nazis loved it. It was a propaganda platform for them. They got attention they otherwise would never have received, and sympathy that they otherwise would not have received. So that illustrates one of the unintended adverse consequences of censorship is you censor because you want to reduce the message, right? But in fact, you are amplifying the message. Let me go back to the Nazis in Skokie. When I recently reread the opinions, I had forgotten that, so this is a controversy that gets worldwide attention for at least 2 years. When they filed their application to demonstrate in Skokie, they said they wanted to parade for 20 minutes. They estimated that the number of people who would be participating in that demonstration was 30 to 50 people, which I'm sure is a wild exaggeration. So just, you know, we would never have heard of them, right, if it hadn't been for the well-intended but ultimately counterproductive effort to suppress them. And the provocateurs, including on college campuses, are using that same strategy today. So I mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does wonderful work in constructively, identifying and responding to, checking the potential adverse impact of hate mongers in the United States. Last year, when we had a lot of evidence that white supremacists would be recruiting aggressively on U.S. college campuses, the SPLC issued a wonderful guidance to students on what to do when you know that the alt-right white supremacists are coming to your campus. And they had many constructive suggestions, but a major theme throughout was please resist the temptation to try to censor them, to shut them down, to shout them down, to disrupt them. It may feel morally satisfying, but you are just playing into their strategy. And so, if you want to have your own event that's an affirmative celebration of diversity and equality and inclusivity, but have it far away and don't meet them or confront them face to face. So let me tell you, one of the things that also really was, for me, a pleasant surprise as I did my recent research was how much support there is for this classic American position around the world, including people in Canada. I've already mentioned Alan Bourvoy, and I quote other eminent Canadians as well as people from many other countries, and from international human rights organizations and agencies, including the United Nations and regional human rights organizations. And I'm not talking only about free speech activists. I'm talking about human rights activists in support of the rights of traditionally excluded or marginalized or oppressed groups are saying we ought to move away from a censorship strategy and more in the direction of the United States approach. Not because of the First Amendment. Obviously, most of these countries have nothing similar to the First Amendment, but simply from the perspective of what actually works. And let me just cite one example. The commission to eliminate, I'll give two examples. The Commission to Eliminate Racial Discrimination under the International Treaty with the same acronym, as many of you know, that's a UN treaty that not only permits censorship of hate speech, but actually requires it. Signatories to that convention, unless they make a reservation, as the United States and other countries have done, are obligated to criminalize, to outlaw hate speech. Both that organization and the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI, which takes a similar pro-censorship position in terms of no First Amendment obstacle, in their recent reports of actual status of equality and discrimination and discriminatory violence, reached the conclusion that the censorship laws were so ineffective that they were urging a counter-speech approach instead. ECRI, I do remember the exact words, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, in its most recent monitoring report, literally said, counter-speech is much more likely to be effective than censorship, much more likely. And sadly, if you follow what's been happening in European countries and others, there's no correlation between strictly enforcing anti-hate speech laws and the reduction in violence. And again, let me use Germany as an example, given my own personal history, and I think many of us associate it as the epitome of Nazism, but it's also the epitome of very tough hate speech laws. With the possible exception of the Middle East, Germany has the strictest anti-hate speech laws that are very strictly enforced. And you know that an explicitly racist party, the AfD, has been doing very well in elections in Germany, including in the most recent Bavarian elections. And in the last national election, nationwide, got 13% of the vote. I don't know, I'll use anti-Semitism as an example, although there's recently been a lot of publicity about discriminatory violence against immigrants and against refugees and against Roma and against Muslims. The anti-Semitic violence has been so horrific that Angela Merkel felt compelled recently to appoint a first commissioner ever, cabinet-level commissioner, against anti-Semitism. And the head of the Jewish community in Germany has warned observant Jews that they should not go out in public wearing the yarmulke. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the skull cap that observant Jewish men wear as a sign of respect to God, a religious duty. And I mean, the idea that, again, in the 21st century, the head of the Jewish community would tell members of the Jewish faith that they are taking an unjustifiable, an unwarranted risk by obeying this religious command. Let me just give you one episode to illustrate that this is not paranoia. In April, and this got a lot of attention because it happened to coincide with Israeli Independence Day, so it got a lot of attention. A German man who was Jewish in Berlin was being visited by an Israeli Arab friend. And they were going out, and this is in Berlin, right? One of the major capitals of Europe, of the world. And it was a trendy area in Berlin, too. And so the Jewish man takes off his yarmulke as they're going out. And his friend from Israel says, "Why are you doing that?" So he explained this edict, and the friend from Israel said, "It's incredulous. That cannot be." So he takes the yarmulke, puts it on his head, and went out, and they were promptly beset and beaten and subject to, just really vile anti-Semitic tirades. And it was all, as so many injustices are these days, captured on screen, and you can watch it on YouTube. That prompted the editorial page, an op-ed columnist in the New York Times, Bret Stephens, wrote a column about that. And again, I remember the words. He said, "To be a Jew in Europe now is to be living on borrowed time." Now, that may be a hyperbole, but certainly, despite very strong hate speech laws that are very strongly enforced, our European comparable countries are having at least as bad a problem with hatred and discrimination and violence as we are having in the United States. And that's why advocates of human rights there are saying they think we're doing a better job with our alternatives to censorship. And let's see. Oh, wow, I've talked for a long time, haven't I? And I'm so sorry. I was supposed to be looking at the clock to self-censor here. So I should probably talk for about 10 more, 5? 5:10? Well, I'll try to keep it brief because I really want to emphasize the positive message here. So the negative one is that censorship is even less effective than I had thought it would be. The positive one is that the alternatives to censorship are even more positive than I thought they would be. And that's echoed, as I say, by human rights activists from around the world whom I quote. So I have to say that the non-censorial alternatives include anti-discrimination laws that are complete and enforced very vigorously. In the United States, we've got a lot of these laws, but we don't have enough. We have unfinished business. So, for example, and forgive my ignorance, I'm not sure what the state of the law is in Canada, but in my country, woefully, in most of the country, it is still legal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And rather than focusing on, a manifestation of deep-seated attitudes of discrimination, the priority has to be to deal with those attitudes, which you do through education, and certainly to outlaw the manifestation of the expression in actual discriminatory conduct. We also have a very serious problem of discrimination in voting. Again, I hope that you don't have those problems, but even though we have this historic 1965 landmark voting rights law, there are voter suppression measures that are being enforced all over the United States that are disproportionately disenfranchising people of color and people with disabilities and college students and the elderly and the disabled. So that really has to be a priority to vigorously enact and enforce laws against discriminatory conduct. And then there's this concept of counter speech. And it may sound rather tepid that words, but on the other hand, it's precisely because words are so powerful that we have the impulse to censor hate speech, right? And I recognize that words can be powerful. The United States Supreme Court recognizes that words can be powerful, and it's precisely because they have so much power to do good as well as harm that we oppose censorship. So, yes, they can do a lot of harm, but enormous amounts of good. And the particular type of counter speech that you engage in will be strategically decided depending upon the particular context. So I've given you one example, kind of counterintuitive, one example of how we exercise our free speech rights to counter hatred is through silence, through ignoring the hate mongers, depriving them of the attention that they're seeking. One thing that we have to do is whenever there are incidents of hate speech, to condemn it, to speak out against it. If it happens on a college campus, the leaders of that community should defend the freedom to voice the idea, but say that the idea is contrary to the values of the institution, to offer affirmative support for the people who are disparaged. And that actually, not only is it consistent with common sense, but there's actually a lot of social science research that shows how powerful and helpful that kind of counter speech can be to negate what would be a harm to those who are disparaged. A sincere apology. Often the hurt is caused in unwitting ways. People are insensitive. And a sincere apology, again, social science has shown that that's extremely beneficial psychologically and emotionally, not only to the person who has been disparaged, but to the person who's giving the apology. And the example that I really just kind of blew me away, because it hadn't even occurred to me. I guess because I'm a debater and a lawyer, I think of counter speech in terms of rebutting the ideas and refuting the false assertions of fact. But if what you're interested in doing is, on a retail basis, shall we say, rather than a wholesale basis, engaging with somebody who has hateful ideas, I was just mesmerized to learn how many examples there are and movements there are of the most dedicated, generous, patient souls who are engaging one-on-one with hate mongers and recruiting them away, redeeming them. This has happened both online and in real space. Many of them, these cases have now been documented. There's a whole genre of TED Talks on point and more and more books on point. And there are a number of organizations have been formed by, there are so many of them, they now call themselves former haters. And one example is a guy named Christian Picciolini, who from the time he was a teenager until he was in his 30s, was the leader of a very violent, vicious skinhead hate organization. And through generous, compassionate, empathetic outreach by others who are not at all supportive of the ideas, but are not treating him as a criminal, as could happen in your country or many other countries, not ostracizing him or demonizing him, as often happens in my country, but reaching out with concern and compassion. He was redeemed and together with others in that situation, formed an organization called Life After Hate. So I would not, and my liberal friends believe in restorative justice and are willing to forgive even mass murderers. So can't we forgive and use restorative judgment, restorative justice toward those who are hate mongers? I think that's something that I quite frankly hadn't had so much hope in until I read so many of these accounts. So I'm going to really respect your free speech by turning it over to you for your questions and comments. And the last word that I'll give before I do that is I have 3 epigrams in my book, all of whom are from minority leaders who champion counter speech as not only more principled but more effective than censorship. And the one that I will quote is Martin Luther King, who said, "In the end, what we will remember most is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." So friends to justice and equality and liberty for all, thank you for not being silent. Thank you.
Nadine, as she indicated, is very happy to hear comments, questions, whatever. So, yes, in the back. Ange is going to bring them. This is all being filmed, and it's going to be on our... Oh, there's another mic there. So I'd ask when you stand up, if you could just identify yourself and then say what you want to say into the mic. And this podcast will be on our website tomorrow.
Very speedy.
Hi, my name is Paul Bones. I'm a longtime friend of the Institute for Liberal Studies, which is why I'm here. I have a couple of questions, but I'll just limit it to one. What is your response to private entities performing censorship like Google, Twitter, etc., and no platforming controversial figures like Alex Jones, Milo Yiannopoulos, whatever his name is, and figures like that?
Great. Did you say your name was Paul?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Paul, thank you, if we can be on a first-name basis. So this is a perfect example of why it's important to voice the pragmatic and policy arguments against censoring hate speech, because the First Amendment does not apply to any private sector entities. So we have to rely on other strategies to persuade them why they should not exercise. Not only do they not have any obligation to respect other people's free speech rights, but they have their own free speech rights, as any newspaper or traditional medium would as well. And the very same problems that bedevil government enforcement of hate speech laws. You know, the inherent subjectivity and vagueness that gives unfettered discretion to the enforcers, so that they tend to use that power to disproportionately to silence objecting voices and protesting voices and minority voices. That same problem exists with the social media. And the disadvantage of amplifying the voices of those who are censored also exists. So let me illustrate both of those points. For the last 4 years at least, there's been a large coalition of civil rights and civil liberties organizations in the US, including the ACLU, that have complained to Facebook. And the problems exist with other entities as well, but Facebook is the biggest game in town, that it is disproportionately enforcing its anti-hate speech standards against Black Lives Matter activists, against pipeline protesters, against those who object to police abuse. And it's not surprising, right? Because those are the challenging the status quo. A lot of civil rights activists actually use the term racebook rather than Facebook. And some feminists and women have complained that the anti-nudity rules are being enforced in ways that are discriminatory against women. In any event, they have enormous power, and I would not want to entrust that power to the tycoons of Silicon Valley any more than to the government. When Alex Jones was kicked off social media, I don't know if you saw, there were pictures of him toasting with champagne because on his apps, which were not censored, immediately he got much more traffic than he had gotten before. So again, the lesson that you're amplifying the voice unwittingly.
Yes, Abbas.
So my name is Abbas Kassam. I'm on the advisory board of the Center for Free Expression.
Oh.
So I 100% agree with what you're saying, but there's another piece to the puzzle from someone who works with minority communities. So you're saying that censoring speech, for example, hate speech, doesn't really work. I agree with you. The flip side of that is sometimes there are communities, especially minority communities, that have no experience with countering speech. So how do you kind of empower them to do that?
That's a fabulous question. Thank you so much for raising it. And here is one of the reasons why the internet and social media, certainly along with every medium of expression, can do a lot of harm. And we know that, including making it easier to disseminate hateful messages. But it also makes it much easier to engage in counter speech. A journalist in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century said sarcastically, freedom of the press belongs to he who can afford a printing press, which meant basically nobody. Now it's much cheaper, not totally free, but much closer to free, to be able to disseminate your message through the internet and social media. And so people without means were behind Black Lives Matter activism and the Me Too movement and other social justice movements, thanks to this relatively inexpensive technology. That said, we are aware of the so-called digital divide, so that the technology is not available to everybody, and also the education to be able to make effective use of it is not equally available to everybody. And it absolutely has to be a priority to, and maybe you don't have those problems in this country. I know you're much more egalitarian in your policies than we are. But in the United States, that is a serious problem, and it's a very significant emphasis of the strategy to make sure that everybody truly does have access to the press and the education, so the tangible and intangible capabilities.
Yes, Dick Moon.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Nadine. That was terrific.
Thanks, Dick.
I guess I want to follow up on the question of...
Identify yourself.
Sorry.
Identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dick Moon. I'm a law teacher at the University of Windsor with an interest in hate speech regulation. Without this being a defense of law, because I certainly understand the limits of law, just to pursue the notion of counter-speech, just a couple of things. First, of course, hate speech takes many forms. And you know, the example of Skokie and, of course, RIV Minneapolis involving a burning cross and so forth are instances where we're not talking about propositions. We're not talking about claims of any kind. What we're talking about, perhaps not true threats in the First Amendment sense, but threats. These are symbols, images that are being employed that really carry a history of violence with them. So the notion of engaging with that, I understand you're talking about a different kind of engagement with hate mongers outside perhaps the scope of that. So that's one concern I have. But even if we understand certain forms of hate speech as propositional in character, the counter speech seems to be increasingly a problem in our kind of fragmented discourse, which I think you were alluding to a minute ago. And so much of what happens as the most extreme forms of hate speech occurs really in the margins of the internet, in which individuals who are like-minded feed off each other in certain ways. And the space or opportunity for counter-speech seems extremely limited, if not entirely unavailable. So that's the concern I have. Thanks.
And the excellent question from Dick, who wrote, as I'm sure you all know, a wonderful report about hate speech, specifically on the internet. And here I have to give a nod not only to scholars who are committing their energies and attention and expertise, but also foundations, and also the internet companies themselves are really putting a lot of resources into how do we combat these problems and how do we harness the tools, the special ability of the internet, not only to engage in counter speech, but to identify what forms of counter speech are most effective. And again, so Twitter is financing some studies, Facebook has financed others. It's a very new field, but a lot of people that I respect are taking it very seriously. And I think that, what can I say? You have to have hope, and I think that that's all I can say, Dick, and you probably know more about it than I do. But so Danielle Citron is an example of somebody in the United States who has written a book about hate crimes and hate speech in cyberspace. I'm very happy that she's been enlisted by a number of social media companies to work with them to address these problems. And I'm sorry, I can't be more specific than that. It's a serious problem, and it's being seriously addressed. And your ideas, I'm sure, are, in fact, let me ask you, since you have worked on it. No? Law professor can't do that to another law professor? You know, and I don't think it's a unique problem. That's something that's important for us to recognize, and I know Dick isn't asking it in this vein, but every time we have a new communications technology, a lot of people are unduly exuberant about its potential positive impact. I think that's the reaction that a lot of people had to the internet. And then a lot of people are unduly pessimistic. And I think that I'm confident that we'll weather this.
Okay. Yes, Jamie, and then back.
Thank you, Jamie Cameron. I teach at Osgoode Hall Law School. I guess I wondered as I was listening to Nadine, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for coming, Jamie.
I wondered to what extent just listening to your argument really is basically is empirical in nature, because I thought I heard you say that hate laws are not effective and counter speech is effective. So I just sort of wonder if there's more to it than that, because if there isn't, then it's really sort of a contest on that terrain.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And if I have to, so to me it's kind of a hypothetical, but as a law professor I can't fight the hypothetical. So let's assume that there wasn't that evidence. Would I still as an independently sufficient basis based on classic liberal principles, or I'm looking for Matt as the Institute for Liberal Studies, I would have to say yes, that to me there is such an inherent value in individual autonomy and freedom of choice. But that said, to me, non-censorship is based on the viewpoint of the idea, is an essential underpinning not only of individual liberty, but also of democracy and also of equality and dignity. I really can't disentangle them. And if you will permit me, please, I want to tell you about the latest Supreme Court decision in the United States, which illustrates this. It was, and despite all of the fracturing on the United States Supreme Court, including on many First Amendment issues, the court has been unanimous in opposing censorship for hate speech for many decades now. And the most recent example was 1 year ago when the court 8-0, Gorsuch wasn't yet voting. But you know, from the most liberal to the most conservative, reaffirmed the viewpoint neutrality principle in a context that I think beautifully happens to illustrate how essential that principle is for individual dignity and equality, including on the basis of national origin and ethnicity. It was a case called Mattel versus Tam, and it involved the plaintiff was an Asian American rock musician named Simon Tam, who formed a band with other Asian American rock musicians, and they chose a name for their band which was an illegal name, impermissible for trademarking under a provision in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Statute that was essentially a hate speech law. It had never been reviewed by the Supreme Court. And it made it illegal to have a trade name that was disparaging or dehumanizing on the basis of race or ethnicity and so forth. So, trigger warning. The name of the band was The Slants, obviously traditionally an ethnic slur against people of Asian origin. And I hope I need not tell you that was not the reason why Simon and his fellow Asian American musicians chose that name. It was exactly the opposite. They wanted to reclaim the term, to celebrate their pride in their ethnic heritage, to assert their dignity. And so when the Supreme Court unanimously struck that down, that was in one fell swoop, reaffirming not only individual liberty, but also equality and empowerment. So I think that that is an argument that's based on principle, but it's, again, not an opposite, it's not elevating the principle of free speech over the countervailing concerns, including equality.
Yes. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. And it's Wayne Simmons, by the way. I'm with the Freedom Party of Ontario. And I just wanted to, I admire your work. I think you used to write for Free Inquiry. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I used to follow your columns.
Thank you, Wayne.
You're welcome. I disagree with you on your position that the Southern Poverty Law Center is a good example of an organization that's fighting for, individuals, if you will, because I think that they are a pretty strong leftist organization that tends to smear people and use freedom of speech in order to do so. So when, if you're Majid Nawaz or you're Ayaan Hirsi Ali or you're somebody that takes a very strong stance against Islam, that you're called a far-right activist. And we had this in Canada as well, in Toronto, with the with Jordan Peterson, and of course the Freedom Party of Ontario has been slandered as well. So I tend to reject your premise, and I also find you very, very heavily slanted towards left identity politics, and not focused on Antifa and organizations that are very violent and even on this campus with a lot of racialist premises that I reject, because I'm an individualist, and I believe that individuals, I don't care if you're a black, you know, I don't care what your background is, Asian or what have you. It is that's an accident of your genetic lineage. It's the individual that matters. It's the individual that counts, and that's what should have been said by this gentleman back here, by the way, because that is the premise of that organization that they are supposed to allegedly respect. So I have to be quite strong in my opposition. But I want to know why you did not emphasize FIRE, why do you not emphasize the Canadian Constitution Foundation, why you not emphasize classical liberal organizations that are fighting for individual rights and not collectivism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Wayne, and I very, very strongly support individual rights, and therefore I recognize that we live in a society where certain individuals are disproportionately denied their individual rights because of societal groups to which they belong. Again, I'm not an expert in Canada, but in the United States, study after study has shown that certain certain racial minorities are disproportionately denied not only liberty, but indeed life itself, deprived of life itself without due process or justice, not because of who they are as an individual, but because of the color of their skin. So those of us who are concerned about individual rights have to, and I think, focus our attention on those whose rights are most jeopardized. That said, in terms of advocacy, I try to suss out my audience, and in limited time, even exceeding unwittingly my time limits, I try to choose examples that I think are going to be most persuasive to the particular audience. So, Wayne, most academic audiences that I address, and I assume this would be typical in that regard, tend to be people who are of the progressive political persuasion, who are deeply concerned, share my concerns about discriminatory violation of rights on the basis of identity. So I want to make the pitch to them why censorship should not be something that they support. But if I were in a different audience, I would use other examples. And my book deliberately uses examples from across the ideological spectrum. So no matter what your own political or ideological views are, I give you examples of how these laws work and are enforced in other countries. So you should say, oh my goodness, I do not want that idea to be suppressed. In terms of the Southern Poverty Law Center, I'm not in a position to completely categorically endorse every single thing that the organization does. I do not categorically endorse, I don't want to shock you, every single thing the ACLU does. I was specifically praising, and I do continue to praise, their generally excellent work in monitoring hateful groups, and even more importantly, giving us strategies to effectively counter the efforts of those groups.
Anyone else, comment or question? Yes. Just a minute. Angela, bring you a microphone.
So my name's Alan Plackett. I'm a retired chartered accountant, but I prefer listening to lawyers because it's more intellectually stimulating. So thank you very much for coming here tonight. I guess the direction you seem to be going is that there's unlimited ability in terms of freedom of expression. That you don't seem to want to put any constraints on it. And I'm wondering whether that's realistic in practice. And maybe we need to get into a definition of what exactly you mean by hate speech. Perhaps that's the answer, because supposing somebody posts a video on YouTube and encourages their supporters to go and raid a particular area of Chicago and beat up black people. So is that covered under some other cut some legal thing, or you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah,
like,
I do.
What are the limits?
And please repeat your name. I didn't.
Adam Plackett.
Adam, if we can be on a first name basis, please. So thank you, because it was one of the things I ran out of time to say in my opening remarks, that even the biggest free speech absolutists such as me and the ACLU and the US Supreme Court does not absolutely support all freedom for all speech. And just as the Supreme Court and the ACLU have said government may not suppress speech because of dislike, even strong dislike of its content, we all agree that in certain contexts, and your example was in a particular context, speech may be punished. It's usually called generally the emergency principle, when under all the facts and circumstances, so it's very contextual, the speech directly causes certain specific, imminent, serious harm, and the only way the harm can be averted is through censoring or punishing the speech. Now, the example you gave, I don't think would quite cut the mustard under the very strict US standard of punishable incitement, because Oliver Wendell Holmes, in a dissent that has since been embraced as the law of the land in my country, said every idea is an incitement, right? And by that, he didn't mean, therefore, we can censor every idea. We have to have a tighter causal connection between the incitement and the harm. So incitement can be punished if it's intentional incitement of imminent violence, and the violence is likely to happen imminently. And in a case, it was a unanimous Supreme Court decision in 1969 that the ACLU handled, defending in that case free speech rights for a group of Klansmen who were demonstrating on their own. Nobody else could see it except they had invited a news person to film their demonstration. And they were saying we should take revengeance on the Jews and send the blacks back to Africa and the Jews back to Israel, and they had guns, and the Supreme Court said that didn't meet the standard. Later on, in another case, because I really like to give examples of the opposite message that's also protected by the same principle, there was a case involving the NAACP, our leading civil rights organization, at about the same time during the civil rights movement. A leader of that organization is giving a speech in which he's urging people to honor a boycott of white merchants that were discriminating against African Americans. And he said, you know, and if any of you breaks that boycott, we're going to break your legs, and we want you to go out and break the legs of other people who are violating the boycott. And the Supreme Court overturned a lower court decision that said that was punishable speech, which would have really put the NAACP and hence the civil rights movement pretty much out of existence. And fortunately, the Supreme Court said that doesn't meet the standard of punishable intentional incitement.
And you might just add, as you did, about the time, why.
That it has to be, because in the NAACP case, there actually was some violence that was committed against boycott breakers, but it was not so tightly in time following the exhortation. And it's basically a functional test. If there's enough time to prevent the feared harm through other means, such as law enforcement protection, such as argument and persuasion and education, then you have to use those non-censorial means.
Anyone else? Yes, in the back of the room, just a minute.
Thank you. My name is Ash Navabi. I'm a friend of the Institute for Liberal Studies. I was wondering if you've ever given any thought to the proposition that all rights are property rights, and so that freedom of speech is really, in effect, some sort of application of property rights. If I'm the owner of Ryerson University, as the owner, as my property, I have the right to censor or promote any speech I see fitting. And so laws regarding speech are therefore laws on property rights, takings of some sort.
I have had that discussion many, many times with my friends at the Cato Institute, in particular my friend Roger Pilon, who's the director of their Center for Constitutional Rights. And I'm not sure what the consequences would be of accepting that position in this context. The ACLU as a civil libertarian rather than a libertarian organization does support certain government regulation, including of property, and private property. And I know in that sense we may well disagree with our friends in the tradition. Roger calls himself a classical liberal, whatever the terminology is. So we have some commonalities and some differences. But I find it very difficult in this particular, in the context of the internet, going back to Dick's point in a way. I am very, very concerned about how those who run the giant internet companies, for all practical purposes, have so much power over our speech, right? The United States Supreme Court recognized this unanimously in another decision last year. It wasn't, they weren't looking at a law that regulated the internet, but it was a law that said that somebody who had been a convicted sex offender was being denied access by the government. The government was preventing them from having access to social media. So the First Amendment did apply. But in the course of explaining why the government could not deprive people of access to the internet, the Supreme Court said, this is a medium that now is the dominant way that most people in our country receive information, engage in communications, not only with their friends and colleagues, but with government officials. So it's the major form of communication for democratic republic as well. And in some sense, it's shocking that we're essentially giving unfettered power to these vastly powerful entities to decide what we can say and what we can't say. Even at the time that I wrote my book, so this statistic is almost 2 years old now, which means it's an understatement, but at that time, Facebook alone said that enforcing its hate speech laws alone, it was taking down 288,000 posts every month. One company, 1 month, one standard 2 years ago. So it's more censorship than all the governments in the world added up throughout history. And I feel very uncomfortable about letting that power go unchecked. I am also deeply skeptical of government regulation because I don't like the way government has regulated traditional communications media. So for me, I'm always thinking, what is the lesser of two evils here? And I would, I do not specialize in the internet. I think that's obvious, and it's clear to me that I really would welcome guidance from any of you who have given a lot of thought to this.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Nadine for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you, Albert.
Lovely discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming, and we hope you come to some of our other events as well.